Thanks, Ellen. Hey, everyone. My name's Menaka. I lead our online communities and social intelligence analytics teams in the US at Ipsos. That means leveraging unstructured social data and curated community discussions to build a better understanding of humans. I am joined today by my colleague, Ped.
Hi, everybody. Ped Howard. I work in the Creative Excellence division here at Ipsos. I've been here around 14 years, originally in the UK before moving over to the US. Kind of held all roles within that division, from leading large global accounts in copy testing to leading our labs practice for creative development and all things in between. Also joined by Rachel.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm Rachel Rogers. I'm also in the Creative Excellence service line here at Ipsos. My background is a long history in the advertising and brand communications industry, working in agencies and for brand owners, developing brand positioning and communication strategies and advertising. And we're also here with our colleague, Seth.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody. My name is Seth Traum, and I run our marketing and brand strategy and innovation consultancy practice here. I've been here for about almost 5 years, which is when we launched the practice. And we tend to work on a lot of cross-functional projects within Ipsos, especially ones that rely upon multiple different types of market research. So for presentation, and you'll see me come back from time to time to talk about a couple different additional topics as we go through and summarize things as we go. And we really started this presentation off focusing on lessons learned from COVID, but we really started to retitle it and think about it as more like lessons learned from COVID, right? We really framed it as a question more than anything, because in the time that we started planning this, there have been some major events that have really rocked not just the US, but the world. And so we're actually in continuous learning mode from these various different crises. And so we're here today to discuss COVID and also Black Lives Matter. And what are the different learnings that brands have from living in this moment, and what can they apply? There's consistent lessons to be drawn from both of these crises, but also there's some really important differences that we want to recognize. And what's really important, though, and impactful, is that both have prompted big changes in consumer attitudes and actions. So you see here a couple different data points to start with. 91% of people controlling their health risks. People have really taken this head on and are being very cautious, mostly, about how they react. And so they're being very careful. And these are probably changes that are going to be lifelong, as we've seen from prior crises and things like the Spanish flu epidemic, for example. Here on the right side, we've got this other data piece here where we talk about 41% of people have taken some form of action for racial justice, whether that's changing their attitudes, whether that's a formal action like marching, or joining people in the debate. And so what's really interesting here is that both of these crises have prompted behavioral changes that look like they are here to stay and that brands need to learn from. And so what I'm going to do now is turn to Rachel, and she'll walk you through what we've learned, starting with COVID-19.
Hi, Seth. It's Ped actually taking this part, but let me take you through a little bit of our COVID learnings. Just see if I have control. Okay, so let's think back to, it seems a long time ago now, when the coronavirus first hit the US. It was the first few days of March when we started to see the first cases in Seattle, so 4 months ago now. And during the next few weeks, as lockdowns were implemented across the US, many of us were forced to work from home, stay indoors, become teachers, cook every night, begin to use video conferencing, not just for work, but for family meetings and for gathering with friends. Life really changed, and it changed fast. And brands responded. They came out with messages of support, showing a deep understanding of the human factors at play, and in many cases, moving away from trying to sell us those goods and services, but really just showing that they were there for us. You know, you can see here there was a lot of the same language coming out. There were unprecedented times. Together we'll get through this. and really showing that empathy. But what did that really achieve? One of the things we saw as we looked into monitoring this is that viewers clearly played back that they were seeing a wall of very similar advertising. It's not that it wasn't correct, it was absolutely tugging on their heartstrings, but it didn't really do anything for them. While most people could recall seeing advertising, with 65% saying that they'd seen something related to coronavirus, very few could connect it to any specific company or brand, with less than 20% being able to name that specific company or brand that they'd seen COVID advertising from. And our comments in our initial research at this point quickly demonstrated how the viewers were becoming jaded. Stop with the "we're here for you" lies. An excessive number of brands are reiterating that we're in this together theme. It's overdone and cliched. We ran some of these early ads through our creative assessment tool, Creative Spark, at the end of March, and we saw this for ourselves. About 10 ads that we tested at that point were consistently failing to break through, and they were struggling to be linked to the brand advertising. That was compared to both our general industry benchmarks and non-COVID ads that we were testing at that same period. As we dug deeper into this, it was clear that the early sentiment was correct. Brands and agencies were tapping into relevant and true insights. It wasn't that they were missing the mark or not being correct in what they were saying. But one of the problems that we saw was that they'd all mostly tapped into the same insight. They'd all gone about the same process at the same time, and created this sea of sameness in advertising. But what's more than that, very few of these initial ads had any real answers. The ads were holding a mirror up to society. In some ways they were saying, we get it, we know that life sucks right now. And consumers said, yes, we know. But what consumers also wanted was something tangible to grasp onto. 69% saying that they wanted to hear from brands and companies on what they had to offer. 67% saying that I want to hear how brands and products are useful in my situation right now. And then, maybe the kicker on that, 50% saying that they're tired of seeing brands that are just offering solidarity or support. Another thing that we noticed as we tracked along with this journey, and at this point I'll just point out that we broadly model where people are on a pathway through COVID-19 in all of our research at Ipsos, applying this kind of similar framework of, are people early on, are they getting used to it, are they coming out of the other end? And we looked at these need states and what people want and expect from advertising from the acclimation stage at the start of that journey, more towards a rebuilding phase. And we see a very clear difference. We see a sharp drop in those who are expecting or wanting solemn, serious, and sympathetic tonalities to the advertising. And then we also see a corresponding jump in people who are looking for something more lighthearted. In essence, as people start to get used to the situation, they understand that the world may not be great right now, but they don't need reminding of it anymore. And sometimes it's nice to have an escape. Another thing we've been doing throughout this whole crisis is using some advanced text analytics to monitor how people want advertising to make them feel during COVID-19. Now, this is something that has stayed pretty consistent. People have generally wanted a mixture of security and positivity, the two over on the right here. These are the two that have generally come through the highest in every phase of research that we've done, wanting to feel good again and improve their well-being, but also to feel safe and secure. I'll just point out that at this point, the very few people ever want brands to stop advertising. That was something that was a concern early on in this, but the red section here about cutting back and stopping on advertising, it's been consistent at around 8 to 10% throughout. But this consistency in the need states and these consistency in the positivity and security doesn't mean that there's only one answer. And again, if everybody was to look at this and take the same message away, you could very easily fall into another sea of sameness with the same messaging. So as we've progressed, we've started to distill some of these themes out, and we've identified that there are different needs and desires that ads can tap into, all from within these same themes that are coming through. So we know that the world is changing, and we have these new needs that people are wanting to be addressed. So we're looking at controlling your health risk. So 91% saying that they're controlling their health risk with activity limits and distancing. We're also talking to people, finding out that people are, 84% are finding ways to make change more comfortable. 81% making new ways to connect socially. And then 80% reconsidering what matters. So there's a theme about these things that are changing that you can distill down further into 5 new different need states. And we've identified some ads that are doing each of these as we look at it. So you have the first section, which is about control, which is about how consumers can stay in control, how they can stay safe, how they can adapt to what's changing, but not feel unsafe or threatened within it, and keep moving throughout that. There's another one about comfort, which is about reminding people of the comforts of home, of being as comfortable as possible, and how they can keep that comfort with them. A third theme is about connection, about how you can maintain meaningful connections, about how you can find new ways to connect with people, and how you don't have to feel that isolation. Even though you can't go out in the world, you can still connect to your loved ones in many different ways. Another one is about change, new solutions to new situations, about how certain things are no longer possible, but the old ways of doing something aren't possible, but that you can find new ways to still do that. There's some ads that we'll talk about here. A lot of them are theming around dating and marriage and weddings and things like that. And then finally, there's create. There's being creative. Which falls into a number of different categories of, some people, some of the home improvement stores identifying that people who are stuck at home and identifying they're going to be spending all summer at home, wanting to get creative and to build new things. And also, more just about killing time when you don't have the same hobbies available to you, and still fostering that creativity within the community. We look at some of those ads. We tested 5 of those more recently, and what we saw was a very clear jump in branded attention. So it's clear that brands in general, as they start to identify these more specific need states, away from that more general "we're here for you" theme of early on, we've seen much better results overall, with that branded attention metric jumping up significantly from the first batch of ads to what we've tested now. So what's drives success? Well, in general, it's been relevant and it's well branded. So if we think about some of these themes, so for the control theme, we saw a very strong ad for Dunkin' Donuts. It was very simple. You can watch these ads at the bottom in the final deck with these links. But it's very clear that they use their distinctive assets. We know that that's the biggest driver of branding in advertising anyway. So Dunkin' has their colors, their products, their symbols, their distinctive assets. And it just shows very clearly how you can be in control when you go to Dunkin'. It's very clear about their extra safety procedures, how you can go through the drive-through, you can still go about your normal business and not feel unsafe or threatened by it. Jared made a really great ad about change. Now, a lot of ads have used user-generated content. Many of them have failed to deliver a branded message with that. The issue obviously being that user-generated content was not created by you, so the branding isn't as dialed up as you typically would when you're creating advertising. But they did a nice way of always linking it back to their core theme of showing how weddings were different, how some people were doing smaller gatherings, right down to just the 2 people getting married, about people doing video conferencing to join in the weddings, and they kept a very clear theme that was core to the offer of Jared, and therefore it managed to continue being linked to their brand. Another good ad was from Etsy, repurposing some live action footage here, but also positioning how you could still support creativity. So a lot of people, when stores were closed, they couldn't visit their local stores, they couldn't visit the sort of independent retailers that a lot of people like to shop from these days. But Etsy was making it clear that you could still tap into that same community of independent retailers and creative people, and not have to go towards the big global multinational companies to buy things. You could still access those smaller stores via Etsy. That's a good way to get to that. But some of the challenges, so two of the other ads that we tested now, is still delivering that convincing brand role that's reflective of the positioning. So Domino's had another one about comfort. It was clear that it was for Domino's. People saw that it was a pizza ad, but it didn't really drive any behavior change or tell them anything different. People already knew that they could get Domino's delivered. It wasn't really changing anything for them or inspiring any change there. Heineken did a good ad about connection. It was a good insight about the difficulties of connecting. There was consistent Heineken branding throughout. But again, it didn't really communicate anything about the brand, about the product, about the brand's values. It was another one of those, it was holding a mirror up and saying, we understand what the world is like right now, without really offering much as here's how to address it, here's how to think about it differently, here's how to improve it. So it struggled a bit on that. And that comes to, one of our other findings, that 56% of consumers, they feel that sometimes brands are just trying too hard to make a connection with them. It almost lacks that empathy because they're trying so hard to make a connection, but they're not really, consumers sort of miss that realism of what are you actually doing for me? What are you offering for me right now? And so, this is, again, showing that behavior change is still mixed between the different ads that we're seeing even at this later stage. The end question for us really is, as it always has been, why are you making a COVID ad? What's the specific aim or objective right now? Sometimes it still feels about that, and an ad that could have not been about COVID is shoehorning the current coronavirus situation in just for the sake of saying something that's relevant. And that's actually hurting the ad's ability to break through versus sticking to what the root cause is. So, we're still seeing that it's not about saying something for the sake of saying something, but really just considering why it is that you're advertising. Back over to you, Seth.
Sure, thanks, Ted. So to summarize what Ted has been taking us through, we want to talk about what lessons we've learned from COVID-19 through the brand lens. And so the first thing we saw is that brands jumped into advertising during COVID, but they didn't really tell. They all sounded alike. Their messages didn't link back to their brand equities. And this is why you hear people talking about this sea of sameness that exists. Everybody sounded the same. Nobody really differentiated. They were great caring messages, but they didn't go beyond that. People wanted messages that are more relevant to brands and mention specific actions. So when Ted was talking just a moment ago about Heineken, for example, the challenge was that they were painting a picture of what life was like, but they didn't have anything that was really specific to Heineken or what Heineken was doing. And so that's a challenge right there. We need to make sure, brands need to make sure that they're really showing what impact they're having and what they're doing, because nothing was accomplished by brands putting out these feel-good ads that didn't link back to their essence. Finally, we also saw something really interesting, that people are yearning for lighter-hearted content to provide a break from reality. And Ted talked about how people want security, they want positivity. And so that's really where that lightheartedness came through. But the big challenge for us as we go into this second crisis that we've seen happening around the world, how can a brand in a lighthearted way when there's really nothing that can make light of the situation that we're in, when it's a very heavy situation with a lot of impactful ramifications. So now I'm going to turn over to Rachel, and she'll take you through this next section on Black Lives Matter.
Thank you, Seth. So the racial justice movement has the potential, we think, to be much more consequential for brands than in some ways than the COVID experience, notwithstanding that COVID is obviously an enormously impactful, scary, and ongoing situation. People are really taking the racial justice movement very seriously. We're seeing here from these numbers that a lot of people are taking some kind of action. 59% of Black Americans, 65% of 18 to 34-year-olds, 34% of white Americans have all claimed to take some action within the movement over the last 4 or so weeks. But even beyond that, the movement has been very broad in terms of its impact on action. As you can see from these numbers, it has spanned generations, it has spanned regions, it spans races. So a big impact on people's actions and affecting a wide swath of the population. And for people, many people who have not taken action, one of the things that we've seen is that this tends to come from a lack of knowing what to do exactly. This is a factor in those that seem to be inactive or indeed passive. That they're driven by a question about how best they can contribute. So even among those who are not doing very much right now, this is not necessarily something to be understood as a lack of interest, a lack of concern, or indeed a resistance to the movement. Potentially an opportunity for marketers and brands to find ways to help people to take action and to contribute something that they want to contribute as part of this movement. We wanted to learn from people which brands, what kind of brands could take a stance on racial justice. And we were a little surprised when we got this data back. People believe that any brand has a right to appropriately take a stance on racial justice. 58% of our respondents agreed that any brand could stand up at this point and make some kind of statement. Our surprise came really because we anticipated here that there would need to be a basis for permission. And as you can see from some of these other numbers, we asked about the kinds of permission that brands might need to speak out. For example, would they need to be brands that in particular represented Black Americans as consumers? Would they need to be brands that had already got a good record of diversity around racial justice? Things like that. Did those sorts of backgrounds give a brand more justification in speaking out at this time? What we've seen here is that maybe not. Many brands can appropriately decide how to take action. And this could be really a reflection for many of the perceived inarguability of racial justice as an issue, almost being understood as brands ought to be taking a position of some kind, saying something in this very important movement. And then we also see that nearly 40% of consumers believe that brands should not get involved in advertising around issues like racial justice, that they should stay out of the dialogue. And those numbers actually mask a very wide spectrum of consumer opinion, with essentially young urban city dwellers at one end of a spectrum and older rural dwellers at the other. And I think this is where we start to see in the numbers a confluence of consumer, citizen, partisan opinion, which is what makes this issue so sensitive for brand owners. Really, people are beginning to conflate their points of view, their opinions about brands, about society, justice, and potentially, of course, also their purchase behavior and brand preference. So it's the merging of these personas within consumers that makes it so important to manage into this particular crisis as a brand. And again, we see this dynamic when we look at who is paying attention to advertising right now on this topic. Overall, about 50% of our respondents claim to recall seeing advertising themed around racial justice. And again, we see that there are certain groups of consumers who are much more heightened in their awareness around the topic. So again, 62% of people under 34, 54% of urban dwellers, 64% of Black consumers are very attuned to advertising on this topic. As with COVID, however, we see few brands are receiving positive credit for their actions. Again, a bit of a sea of sameness is emerging and proving to be a similar trap for brands. And some of the consumer commentary around this speaks to a bandwagon effect, a sense that every brand is jumping on this and copying and coming out with very similar messaging, such that there is, again, a lack of effective branding by and large. The ability to own a distinctive message on this topic is still the challenge. So while, as we saw earlier, consumers do believe that it's appropriate for many different brands to speak on this issue, for brand managers, the challenge remains, how do I do that in a way which rebounds in a positive and effective way to my particular brand? You can see here in our word cloud that some brands that have consistently spoken out have got some credit here, such as Nike, Ben & Jerry's, and Amazon, by dint of their very broad reach with their homepage. So examples of some good practice in this area seem to us to really cohere to some key principles that we see playing out again and again. One is that they have based their response in something that they have done consistently from some point in the past. So they're not perceived as opportunistic. They aren't perceived to be jumping on a bandwagon. Perhaps the best known is Nike here and their very high profile support of Kaepernick, which enables them to really escape that trap of being seen to be opportunistic. All of these brands have also done work to take action. So they're very focused on doing and not just saying. They are supporting political positions, they're donating money, they're taking corporate action around diversity, and they're very clear about what their commitments to those actions are and have been. And they are also utilizing the kind of messaging which is resonating around this message around this issue right now. So they're speaking to the broad effects of racism. They're talking about endemic problems, systemic problems. They are acknowledging what many consumers would perceive to be the right way of speaking about this particular issue. And Nike, of course, harking back to the point that Ped was making and that we learned consistently from our testing efforts, branding is very important. And Nike in particular, I think, can be called out for doing a very smart integration of a key brand asset in this particular issue. So their do it slogan being turned to don't do it. And very effectively, therefore, branding their message, even while using the white on black moniker. So if a brand is to take action, what kinds of actions can brands consider taking? Some things here that appear to be meaningful to consumers across a wide variety of different things. So brand owners can really consider a mix of different things, all of which will be applauded by consumers as meaningful. These can go from things such as educating the community, their consumer base on racism, through to making statements of support, calling for political change or social change or policy change, making donations to organizations that are fighting racism, and of course making pledges within their own organizations around diversity and inclusion. All of these are meaningful to consumers and important ways in which brands can act as much as a basis for then subsequently messaging and speaking. And of course, a key question for brands remains, what will the consumers themselves actually do? will they specifically vote with their wallets around this issue? Will there be some impact on their purchase intent? And asking this question of consumers now seems to suggest that some will. We ask this question regularly on an ongoing basis in one of our tracking surveys, and we've seen a significant increase here over the last 2 to 3 weeks in consumers' belief generally that they will factor in equality of opportunity across gender and ethnicity as a purchase factor for them. So up by 35% in the last 2 to 3 weeks. And again, the same story emerging about which particular consumer cohorts this matters to: young people, city dwellers, Black Americans, all above that general population figure in terms of thinking that they will factor this into their purchase intent and behavior. And it's the same groups of consumers who are also claiming that they're going to check up on you. They are more likely, they say, to actually follow through on what brands are saying by investigating what they're actually doing. In the general population, this number of 42% is quite high. People do not want to be hoodwinked. They want to believe that brands are actually doing what they're saying that they are doing. And again, we see these numbers significantly pop when we talk to younger consumers, urban consumers, Black consumers. These are the consumer groups who are particularly going to hold brands to account around what they're actually doing. And in fact, we're seeing pop up a number of apps that are making it very easy for consumers to do that. Just plug in the name of the brand, plug in the name of the company, plug in the name of the celebrity, and you can find a clear account of what that particular individual or entity has actually done. So we're seeing people wanting to hold to account brands and other public figures in this movement as to what they're actually doing.
All right.
So Seth, please summarize for us our lessons from both crises.
Sure, thanks, Rachel. So the first thing that we learn when we look at both crises together is that messaging alone doesn't work. Right? It was not enough for brands to acknowledge that there's a problem or to stand in solidarity. The response to Black Lives Matter, sea of sameness that Rachel took us through. And the message is important, but alone it's not effective. It's not enough to say we feel for you or we're in the same boat. We also learned from looking at both crises that authenticity is now a necessity. The most effective responses have to be authentic to a brand. They can't just be these same types of comments that anyone else can make. They really need to be unique to a brand and in a brand voice. So while brands that have previously taken action to support an issue are credible, if other new brands are trying to step into the fray, they first have to demonstrate their commitment, because consumers have no tolerance for platitudes that are devoid of action. They really need to see that brands are walking the walk. And so to talk more about that, it's really that brands must do and then say. So what we're really seeing come to the forefront with Black Lives Matter versus COVID is that now there's an action that companies can take that's more internal in nature. It's not just making comments about how we're here for you or we're making our stores safe for you or our environment safe for you, but they actually now have an ability to the policies and the ways that they run their companies, for example. So with racial injustice, brands are seen as part of the system that's prolonging it. And then that's really come to the forefront pretty quickly. Brands must define how they're helping society or reforming themselves, including admitting past faults and publicly taking. So it's not enough to say we're in it with you. What really has to be done is that brands need to stand forth and say, this is what we've done in particular, and they need to have the track record to be able to back that up. And then actions must be maintained. As Rachel said, there's apps now that allow companies to be tracked and celebrities to be tracked and people to be able to see what are these people or companies doing, and they can do that in an ongoing fashion. So we know that actions will be continuously monitored, and brands are definitely going to be called out if they go off the path that they've promised to be on. Because for the first time, consumers are actually using their wallets to do the talking. We talk about a do-say gap at Ipsos. People say they're going to do something, but then actually doing it is the challenge. So there's this gap between what they say they'll do and what they do, right? That's the do-say gap. And what we're finding is that the do-say gap is lessening. People are saying that they're going to do something, they're committed, and they're following through. And so they're really using their wallets to tell companies what they think of them. So now I'm going to turn over to Menaka, and she's going to walk us through what we can do.
Thanks, Seth. All right. So as Seth mentioned, I'm going to actually go into what now, right? We just went through a lot of information about what we've been learning going through the pandemic, the BLM movement. And the reality is neither are over by any means, right? We're still, at least in the US, in the thick of a pandemic. Cases are rising. I live in Los Angeles. We had our highest daily case count yesterday recorded since the start of this pandemic. So clearly we have a long road ahead of us, and there's still a lot of work to do. So what can we really learn from how people are feeling right now? So what I'm going to take you through is just a few quick slides. We are monitoring social conversations where we have an ongoing community that we leverage for our syndicated learning, and we're talking to people on a daily basis. So as things are very dynamic, we obviously want to stay close to that understanding and how that's evolving. The reality, like I said, is that cases are rising in the US, and as a result, when we first saw that people were starting to kind of feel like they were going back into the rebuilding phases, as Ped mentioned earlier, we are seeing that there's kind of a boomerang back where people are going back into those earlier phases of kind of reacclimating themselves to stay at home, quarantining, getting through a longer bridge, whatever that bridge looks like. And as a result, there's a lot of concern about this resurgence. In addition, what people are most concerned about is really their social and emotional well-being. You know, the economy comes into context here, but when I'm thinking about myself as an individual, I am worried about my kids. I'm worried about my family. I'm worried about the long-term impact of living through a very trying and difficult time. These are the things that we're hearing from people more than anything, as you can see in the topic wheel on the right here. But through that, you know, we have been tracking the emotional state of people through our community on a weekly basis. And one thing that has been really interesting to see is that there's been a dominant emotion of gratitude and calm coming through in recent weeks. So in the midst of the pandemic resurgence, the rising cases, the unknown that we're facing, there's almost like this, okay, I can do this. It's July. We've been through the last few months. It's been really difficult, but you know, how can I rise above this? How can I learn from what I've gone through already and try to get through this moving forward? And I think that does link to what Seth was mentioning in terms of people realizing they do have to make action or take action to get to a better outcome. On top of that, that feeling of being more woke is leading to this expectation that brands have to be part of that solution as well. Myself as the individual has a role in that, and I have to be a part of that process, but brands have a really important role as well. And I was talking to our public affairs team, and they're saying, you know, the trust in government is lower than it's been in a long time. And as a result, brands are kind of filling that gap. How can brands be part of the solution? So we're seeing that the pandemic, the BLM movement, they're waking people up to things that may have already been there and been so embedded in our society, but because of the heightened sense of difficulties that people are living through, we're seeing that people all of a sudden are realizing, oh man, I need to take care of my health. I need to save more. I need to be thinking about the impact of racial inequity. Like, these are things that aren't new issues, but they're things that people are just much more, there's just much more awareness. And as a result, when you look at what people are expecting from brands right now, it is very much linked to that emotional piece. How can you, the brand, show us that you have generosity and dedication, and you can be helpful to pushing us into a better place moving forward. And that's really reiterated. Go to the next slide. When we look at social conversation, because social can be a very divisive place, particularly right now, but it's also a place where they're very quick to call brands out. And that perceived hypocrisy there's just a heightened sense of that, right? We saw that in a lot of the data that Ped and Rachel went through. And we're seeing that there's almost this like feeling like, oh, are we seeing this again? Like, what's going to happen? Is this real? Or are they just saying it because they feel like they should say it? So really kind of owning that authenticity and having really committed actions against it are things that people are expecting. And if not, if they don't see that, they're definitely calling it out in social conversations as well as with their wallets more and more. If we go to the next slide, just building on that point, I think we're seeing that there is this feeling like, is this really going to be long-term, particularly in the context of the racial inequality conversation, right? We saw a lot of brands speak out and kind of own some of the things that they could be better in, but is that really long-term? Are they just saying it because they feel like they need to right now? And for the most part, people are feeling like, I don't really know if this is going to be long-term. There's hope that it will be. There's hope that there will be real meaningful change. And we see that in the social conversation as well as in our community discussions. But it really is up to brands to own that and make that part of their core foundational strategy as they look forward. So this last slide I'll show you is where we looked at open-end responses from our community members, where we asked them, why are brands standing out right now in the midst of COVID? And then we asked the same question early June when the BLM movement was really starting to rise. And why are brands standing out in the context of BLM? And what you can see in the center of this, in terms of those associations, there were some really clear similarities in terms of what's standing out. And it very much links to this idea of the brand's role in helping humanity, really, at the core, right? So you can see how it's generosity, caring about employees, caring about people, being supportive, creating a sense of community, right? These are things that people actually expect brands to have a role in. And, while the divisiveness in social reveals that how people think about humanity could have differentiation there, the reality is, at the end of the day, people do care about the safety of their family, the safety of their friends, the safety of their community, and they do think that brands have a role in making that better. So back to you, Seth.
All right, thanks, Menaka. So I want to summarize really all that we've discussed so far today and walk you through what brands should do. The first thing is an honest assessment of themselves. And they need to understand how consumers see them and what they stand for. They have to acknowledge if they've previously supported the current issue. And have they done so publicly? They also need to determine what role they can now play. So a really introspective assessment of what they've done so far and how they're most likely being viewed right now. Sorry. If someone else has control, can you advance the slide, please? There we go. Thank you. Next thing is companies need to address any weaknesses or inequities. So brands must first get their own houses in order before they start to talk the talk. Otherwise, they'll be publicly called if they don't also walk the walk. And we've talked about this throughout the presentation today. People are examining companies. People are examining brands. People are examining even personalities and people as brands. And when they're examining them, they're doing so with a pretty harsh lens. And so the question is, can these brands really stand on their own and be able to do what they say that they're going to do? Because not only is there that do-say gap that people have that I talked about before, but we also see sometimes that happening with brands as well. And so they need to make sure that what they're doing actually matches how they are going to be talking about themselves. Next, they need to communicate in a brand appropriate manner. They have to be true to their brand equities when sharing their message with the world. And that's one of the challenges that we keep seeing from both COVID as well as the racial injustice challenges through Black Lives Matter. Right? We're seeing that when companies just put out a message and they put out a message about they're there and they're there for support, they're not really linking back to what they're known for, what it is they're standing for, and what people respect. So they need to make sure that all communications are on brand and also can't be replicated by others. Differentiation really needs to come in here. If you're just talking about something that anyone else can make the same statement, then it's not going to be effective for you. And finally, the last point is they really need to stay on that path that they've forged. As Marie and as Rachel talked us through, people are checking up on brands. And not only are they checking up on brands, but they're doing so with their wallets. They're watching closely brands that join the dialogue, and they want to make sure that they're committed to staying the path. And so what brands really need to make sure they do is to stay on that path. So if you think about all this in its entirety, it's really assessing themselves and what they've historically done, addressing any weaknesses or inequities, and making sure that they actually address them prior to making any statements about them, communicating in a brand appropriate manner. How do we make sure as a brand that we are talking in a way that is on brand for us, that people would know and acknowledge us for, and finally staying on that path for good. This is not a momentary change that a brand or a company can make. This is a change that needs to stay. People are watching, people are very attuned to this, and people will continue to be so as we go forward. So that's the content that we had for you today. I wanted to stop at the moment and see if anyone has any questions. There's a presentation that I have access to, so we'll go through those, but for all the people who are still on with us, please do continue to send in some questions as well, and we'll answer them as we go. So the first question we have, someone said to the stat we shared that 91% of people are controlling their health risk. The question was, is this asked on a continuum? Our definitions of control seem to be different. And so Rachel, I'll ask you that. How did we get to that 91% stat?
Okay, that question was in the survey work that we did around people's emerging needs. So we asked them a number of questions around things that they may be doing right now or thinking about doing, and we asked them how actively they were doing those things. So these were things like managing, controlling their situation from a health perspective, trying to find new ways to be creative and to pursue interests, finding ways to make their homes more comfortable as they were spending more time in them. So those sorts of need state areas that we were interested in understanding a little bit more about, we asked people how actively they were pursuing those things, and that 91% is a reflection of a top two box result that reflects people saying they are quite actively or very actively pursuing things that protect their health, their sense of health security.
Okay, thank you, Rachel.
That even in social conversation, we've seen a huge uptick in conversation around telehealth, immunity, and how to boost my immunity. And even when we talk to our community members about what health and wellness means to them, whereas pre-COVID, it may have been more about fitness and losing weight. Now it's very much about staying healthy, and like that awareness has really grown in the context that we're going through.
Yeah, and Menaka, have you seen anything in the communities when we see that there's shifting environments in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, and people are moving from a further stage where they've started to acclimate to the new normal and explore the world again, and they go back to the beginning of this COVID situation and they need to hunker down again? Are you seeing any movement like that?
Yeah, because we've been asking the question against those phases every week in our community. And just this past week in the latest data, we saw an increase in the earlier phases. So people are, and particularly, we cut it by state, obviously, to understand because there's so many nuances in the US, but We are seeing that in places that were open without a lot of restrictions, we're seeing a big uptick in going back to these earlier phases, or phases they may have not even ever been in, quite frankly. So,
okay, thank you. We have another question that came in that asks, and Pat, I'm going to throw this to you. When can we go back to advertising that just talks about our product benefits and produce spots that don't talk about any of these crises?
I think from what we've seen, there was never a need that you had to change from that. In many cases, there wasn't necessarily a need to suddenly change and talk about a different area or what's currently going on right now. If you don't have a service or offer that's necessarily relevant right now, it might be a mistake to kind of shoehorn in talking about COVID or other crises right now. And similarly, it's very easy to get a quick pulse check of whether an ad that you produced prior to this is still going to work right now by running a quick test or assessment on how consumers react to it right now. You'll see if it's appropriate or not to the current climate, whether that's now or whatever else might change in the next few months.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Another question here, any cues on how consumers would monitor brands walking the walk? What parameters do they look for? So I'll start with that and then see if my panelists have anything to add. Rachel talked about the apps that people, one way that we've seen that's getting a lot of traction. We see that these are apps. There's also websites that accomplish the same thing, where you can type in the name of a brand and it instantly shows you what that brand has been doing. Some of these apps use point structures, and so they show whether these companies or brands are plus or minus in terms of the actions they've taken. And so these are ways that's one of the easy ways that consumers are staying on top of things. We also see just over many years, you're seeing a lot more awareness of brands and the fact that brands are these living, breathing things. And so consumers are reading a lot more over time than they used to. And they're reading with a more critical eye. So whereas something might have skipped a beat and people wouldn't have seen it, now they're focused, they're reading. And a lot of times, as you see, the bad news rises more quickly than the good news. So the bad behavior is being seen more, circulated more, and certainly reacted to more. And social media is a significant part of what's going on.
Yeah, I would actually build on that, because I think the COVID actually has created a lot more awareness of brands' practices in the context of safety. We saw that really rose to the top of the list in terms of what people are looking at when they purchase a brand or engage with a brand. Like, are they treating their employees safely? Are they safe for consumers, right? So that's one piece. And then obviously the racial inequality piece. And from a social perspective, we were talking about the cancel culture, which is a very dominant theme in social conversation. But I think that can't be a fear for brands, of being canceled, because the reality is, like, there's just this need for everyone to kind of look internally and be open and real about the things that they can be better at. And that's what we're seeing really dominate the allyship conversations in social as well. So I think those are some pieces that are important to keep in mind too.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Menaka. So we had another question. Are there any brands in the B2B space that you can highlight for COVID and BLM responses? Really interesting question. And while we tend to focus on the B2C because we tend to focus on brands that are advertising, even some of the examples that we've given you have a B2C and B2B element. So Amazon, for example, Amazon is a sizable part of its business. And what they've been doing is they've been showing the changes that they're making internally to manage the response towards COVID and BLM. What's really interesting with Amazon is that they fell down a few rungs in their COVID handling, in that they really didn't do a very good job of sanitizing and cleaning many of their. And then when people rebelled against that, they were very publicly seen as terminating some of those employees. And so they learned some lessons pretty quickly. They learned just how quickly the public tide can turn against a big company, even a company that serves such an incredibly high need during times of COVID. And so we've seen reactions from them in terms of how they communicate to all of their partners and constituencies. And this is something that is some public, but also there's some private going on, where you see things like even leaked memos that are really explaining what they're doing internally and how it's helping people. Anyone have anything to add?
There was an interesting case in the B2B world back in some of the early COVID stuff we did. A few people on our team were really impressed with a DoorDash ad, which highlighted how restaurants were still working and how you could still get food delivered and these sorts of things. We actually tested it in a more B2C setting and it didn't do so well. But when we looked at the results, we thought that it was probably also a good B2B play in showing that they were supporting these restaurants who were struggling, even if it didn't have such a good response in the B2C side.
And I think we've also seen some good advertising from some of the technology companies, really those that have apps and capabilities to help people to connect, essentially. So I'm sure many of our audience will have seen advertising from Microsoft for Teams. They've done an extensive amount of advertising, which has really been about demonstrating the features and benefits of Teams. And I think they have met with quite a lot of success with that.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here. Someone saying would appreciate the app's name that consumers refer to monitor their activities and what kind of parameters that go into the scores. So yeah, I know we've referenced that a lot. I guess it's a little bit of a tease. We will make sure that when we upload this presentation at the conclusion of this, that we will add in some of those sites into the presentation so that you'll see it where we referenced it, and hopefully that will be helpful for you. I see one last question here and I think we're running out of time, so we'll make this the last one. The stats reference age, race, urban, but what did you learn about Hispanics or Asians? Rachel or Ped, did we have enough sample to break those out and share those?
Yes, we did. The total sample size was 1,500 respondents, and we actively collected adequate samples for Black respondents and Hispanic respondents in particular. We also did get some data on Asian Americans. So we do have data on those other ethnicities as well.
Okay, great. So for the person who asked that question, we'll have a record of who asked, and we'll make sure to get that data to you. And if others are interested, please let us know. We're happy to share that broadly as well. So at this point, we're up at the end of the hour. So I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us and staying with us to the end. And we really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Seth and Menaka, Rachel, and Ped. That was a really interesting discussion, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, then we will do so by email, and you will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. Additionally, I want to remind you that there's some reference handouts in the section of your event console for more about our research capabilities. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.